Is this a life? We ran from shelling and our situation here is worse. What life is this? We wish to die.
The Syrian conflict is now in its 7th year. Almost 500,000 people have been killed and millions displaced. It's effectively created one of the worst refugee crises the world has ever seen. And one of the countries at the center of it all is Jordan. Since 2011, the Arab nation has taken in more than 650,000 Syrians who have fled the war. But it's taken a toll on the country. At the Syrian Jordanian border area of Ruqban, tens of thousands of refugees are trapped in limbo. Well, the nation's former crown prince has been trying to help. Well, joining me now from Amman is Hassan bin Talal. He's the former crown prince of Jordan and a member of the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor. Sir, it's a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. It's a really terrible time for the Middle East. The Middle East is a mess. Tell me, what are you doing personally and what Jordan's doing to make it a little bit better?
The centrality of Jordan, of course, is evidenced by war and civil strife in Syria, neighboring us, as indeed Syria neighbors Turkey, then by Iraq, also a mutual neighbor. Until recently, of course, the Palestinian-Israeli peace talks are held up, and of course we are expecting very worrying developments, the possibility of an announcement from the United States regarding Jerusalem. And of course the developments in the Gulf and Peninsula region. So you have the Levant on the one side, which incorporates us all, Turks, Iranians, Arabs. And then on the other side you have the Gulf and Peninsula Arabs with the ongoing problems in Qatar, in Yemen and so forth. So it seems that the situation is one of what I call binary politics. We are being fragmented more and more every day, not only states, but also within states, ethnic and sectarian breakup. So what I'm doing, I'll come to in a minute.
Okay, well, let's talk about Israel-Palestine for just a second here, because you brought it up. There is a possible imminent announcement that the US might change its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. King Abdullah has been meeting with Jared Kushner and others from the Trump administration. Do you feel at this moment in time that Jordan might be losing its magic as a kind of peace broker or peacemaker when it comes to trying to push for a two-state solution?
Well, I think what you should bear in mind, speaking of Jerusalem, before we speak of the two-state solution, that as far as Jerusalem is concerned, the Hashemite role, the word Hashemite, of course, takes us back to 1,000 years of history when my forebears were in Mecca, and consequently a Hashemite spiritual emphasis on the noble sanctuary, the holy basin, if you will, of Jerusalem, is, I think, to be discussed in a context which is not the same context as talking about two states and the political context. So we have a holy context, which is ecumenical, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and then you have a political context, which is the Palestine mandate called for the establishment of two states, a Jewish state, which we now have, Israel, and an Arab Palestinian state, which also believes that its flag should be in a capital called Jerusalem. So the question of flags, the question of political recognition are very much a key issue, an emotional issue, and an inherited legacy of 100 years of futility since the end of the First World War. This has to be attended to.
The war in Syria next door has hurt your country. You've taken in a lot of refugees, just like Turkey, just like Lebanon, and other countries that have really carried a heavy burden. The war in Syria itself has hurt the Syrian people. Tell me how the work you're doing is trying to address some of the underlying issues.
Well, my primary concern is human dignity. As you said, I've worked with the legal empowerment of the poor, which is basically making the law work for everyone. But when you talk about our population, we have exploded since the early 1990s from over 3 million to almost 10 million people, or some say more. So what we have are nationals of our country, but we also have Palestinian refugees who became nationals of our country from 1948 to 1967. And then beyond that, you have migrants, immigrants, Syrian, Iraqi. Up till now, we are hosting over 40 different nationalities in different United Nations categories. So as far as direct assistance is concerned, the international community has only honored half of its commitments. We have a problem common with you in Turkey and Lebanon, of course. We have taken, the three countries, 4.7 million refugees, of whom 1.7 are in Jordan, a third of whom are in camps, but the rest are really being hosted by Jordanian services, Jordanian food, Jordanian programs of resilience. And this is very, very difficult. We are all facing what I would call a demographic tsunami.
It's a demographic tsunami, and a lot of the time, at certain times, whether it's Turkey, whether it's the Iraqis, whether it's the Lebanese, and so on, countries have had to face some very harsh realities when it comes to the aftermath of the Syrian war. You have a current situation on your border in Ruqban where 50,000 Syrians are stranded. Is what you're doing personally at loggerheads at the moment with what the Jordanian government is doing as policy, because you are blocking off food supplies because you feel it has been infiltrated by Daesh and people are suffering?
Not at all. I would like to say that I am involved with the Zero Hunger campaign for the World Food Programme, so we always look for ways. We've used cranes, for example, to extend food aid across the border. But as you will appreciate in Turkey, when you have, you say 50,000, I believe it's in excess of 50,000 people in Syria, many of them, of course, deeply suspicious to the security services. Don't forget that 7 Jordanian soldiers were killed in an explosion on the border. So basically, the security had to say enough is enough. But you always have this contradiction between development priorities on the one side and security priorities on the other. And definitely with the winter approaching, there has to be a clear course of action. Some people have suggested balloons, for example. We are already dropping assistance from the air. But once again, this is also part of the power play, because don't forget, this location is not so far from the Euphrates and from American troops on the one side and Russian troops on the other.
Right. Yeah, but we have the Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi saying Jordan will not accept any mechanism that makes it Jordan's responsibility to deal with this issue. It sounds as if he's saying, listen, not our problem, not on our side of the border, we don't care. Am I misreading that?
Oh. I believe you are, if I may. It's not a question of we don't care. We care very much. If we had not cared, we would not have opened our borders for 1.7 million people, not only from Syria, but before that. In fact, every decade I have lived my life since 1967 with Palestinian refugees, and then every decade the war in this region has meant an influx of refugees. So I want to say we care very much. We are a country that believes in inclusion, not in integration. But at the same time, I think you have to accept that as far as the infiltration by these armed elements, don't forget that it was Jordan that had the explosions in 3 hotels in 2007, even as people were talking about the war on terror in 2010, 2011, we already had a foretaste of that in our own cities. So why should we open the border? I think the foreign minister is right in saying we cannot accept. But the question of I don't care, I don't know in what context he said it. That is his choice of words.
Right. Everybody wants a solution in Syria. A few years ago, more and more players in the region were looking at a solution in Syria that would only ever exist if Bashar al-Assad stepped down or was ousted. Now, many countries seem to be coming around to the kind of reality, it's a bitter reality for them, that Assad might have to stay as part of some solution. Where do you stand on this? Would you accept a Syrian solution with Assad sticking around?
Well, let me put it this way. Since the discussions in Astana, not only in Geneva, but also in Astana, and since the Turkish, Russian, Iranian initiatives regarding Syria, I think it's very clear that the influences are not only from within Syria, the Syrian opposition and the Syrian government and President Assad, whether he remains or goes. This is not the issue. The issue is basically that, as you know very well, the Iranian front line is very much linked to the presence of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And the whole issue of Syria is also an adjunct to the issue of Iranian influence in Iraq. I believe yesterday one of the senior directors, possibly of the CIA, directed a letter to General Soleimani, basically expressing deep concern and misgivings of the United States about the Iranian presence. So I go back once again and say these are binary perceptions. The real solution probably for the region is a federal solution, whereby you recognize that this is a pluralist situation, where you recognize that ethnic and sectarian have to live together, and where you recognize that we need a level of intra-independence, if you will, where we recognize each other and respect each other, but at the same time work together on creative commons, such as water, for example, an issue which President Özal, God rest his soul, raised with me on many occasions, which I'd like to come to in a minute.
Okay, so tell me about water. Tell me how you can use water to solve some of the root causes here.
Well, once again, I have the privilege of chairing a Blue Peace initiative. And when we discuss water or we discuss nuclear power, it's very interesting to see that all the nationalities in the region, including on occasion the Israelis, participating in these conversations in international fora and basically talking about the regional carrying capacity. Turgut Özal, in his vision, was basically that we have to talk about carrying capacity and carrying capability in relation to municipal and industrial water. And I just want to say that with your situation with Iraq, it's interesting to see the Urusu Dam, which, of course, is a vital factor, particularly in the summer ahead, on water sharing between Iraq and Turkey. I hope that these issues, including, of course, the broader region, can be taken into consideration on the basis that no single country can in and of itself solve the water problem in relation to the nexus of energy and habitat. Where people are is not where we want them to be, but this is the product, the consequence of several years of fighting in these countries.
Prince Hassan, you're no longer a young man. I don't say that to insult you, but I want to tap into your wisdom a little bit here. You've been around for a long, long time. You've seen the region's ebbs and flows and ups and downs. Are you a pessimist or an optimist now that you're into your 70s?
Well, I'm an optimist because I believe that the young men and women of this region are really the future. And I think that if we can accept that they have it in them to become stakeholders in their future, basically what we're saying to autocratic rule, enough is enough. We need greater participation by the youth in building citizenship, which in its turn builds the democracy that we talk about. I mean, there's a lot of democracy in the ballot box, but I'd like to see democracy of sharing. And I think that when we say 70% under the age of 30 and so forth, we have a very grim choice. Either it's sharing on the basis of pluralism or continued fighting and, of course, this fragmentation, this balkanization of, once again, what I call the Levant on the one side and the Gulf and Peninsula on the other. So this involves us all.
Prince Hassan bin Talal, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.